it's good. I mean, the Russians should get what they deserve anyway. They should.
Oh my God.
Yeah. You mean world domination, right?
Already red
They should totally get it.
I was not hoping to catch up on it.
Okay, yeah, let's move.
You know what? This is interesting news. I got hate speech pinged, or we did, I should say. We got hate speech pinged for the episode with J-Ray.
No way.
I'm not. I don't know what it is, but we were talking about Lacanian sexuation, so that's like one possibility.
Oh, they didn't tell you what it was.
No, and then I try to find out. I should ask Diego how to do this. He probably has people inside YouTube.
Yeah, my team can do it.
I mean, I'm pretty confident we never did hate speech.
How does that work? Explain that to me. I don't even know. What does that even mean? What does hate speech ping mean?
Somebody reported.
It could be. I think it's almost always AI, though.
Yeah.
Oh.
It pings your video, it gives you a timestamp, and then deletes your video, so you can't really watch it. But I checked the timestamp where it pinged, and when it was when there was a clip of one of the Hegelian e-girls talking. It wasn't when we were talking.
Oh.
So I don't know, like the Hegelian e-girls did try to be edgy and shit, but I don't know, maybe they said or something. I didn't find any actual slur at the timestamp, but I also didn't look very hard. Diego, do you know if you can say on YouTube?
I think you cannot. And also what is interesting now is that the algorithm even identifies when you mute or when you bleep the word. It also identifies by context with artificial intelligence speech pattern. It can identify the type of word you are beeping. So like it's becoming super complicated.
So I have to cut out this whole part then? I can't.
Yeah, you have to completely cut it out. Yeah.
I've never thought of it as that offensive of a word though, you know.
It's a real shame. The woke scold police.
High school slang.
I can tell you, being a father of a neurodivergent kid, it kind of kicks in a wrong way for some people.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, it's not a hill that I'm gonna die on or anything, but it's like that word, unlike other banned bad words, that one's never really directed at the people to whom it's like supposed to apply. That's
at the normal guy acting like one.
Oh yeah.
Or at the normal guy just being,
I mean,
a dumbass.
I mean, is this a North American high school thing? Like we call stuff and we say stuff is all the time, and that's just completely normalized for us. And then you get out into the real world, and it's like those are very offensive terms to use.
Was there any real world reckoning for that? I don't think so. People our age will remember back in the day when you asked to use your friend's CD-ROM burner so you could burn the Marshall Mathers LP.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely remember that.
Oh, yeah. The parental advisory stickers.
Where both of those words and more were used to describe situations where they definitely do not technically apply.
Like, oh my God, making love is so
oh my God, being like a romantic heterosexual couple is so
making love to you is so we should totally just fuck. That makes no sense. Yeah.
Do you know how much work this is going to be to edit right now?
Yeah, I know.
This is gonna sound awful.
This episode is gonna get banned into oblivion if we release it like this.
Yeah, we've got like 4 minutes of unusable recording right now.
Guys.
Great.
Awesome. Great work. Yeah. Great work so far. Now that we got Diego on the team, and it's like great work. Great work.
This is totally worthless for me. Thank you so much for having me on.
Good luck selling
it's
this.
Not
shit.
2005 anymore. Okay. One's and we're not gonna die on this hill. We're not edgy.
I miss the tight jeans and the sweaters.
I miss the R slur.
What would you? There's a question to every culture warrior out there. What would you rather have back from 2005? The R slur or housing prices?
Yeah.
You know what? It's truly offensive. The private property of the means of production. That I take that as a personal offense, to be honest.
Yeah, this is a hill that you can die on.
Actually, I was at a conference. Actually, last time you were recording, and I was at my friend's panel, which was all about like money and the economy, and there was mostly Marxists, and there was a really funny debate between like about Foucault, just kind of like blew up. But then like my friend's paper was so lib. He was just talking about the ways in which the market produces addictive products, like the way that like the market is aiming for the lowest common denominator because it's going to make the most money. So, and it's very analytic philosophy. Like he talked about higher order desires and lower order desires. Like, you know, I mean, we may not agree with that framework, but what was just funny about it was that like his discussant was like, I agree. I think you did a beautiful job of describing how horrible the market is and the way it creates these like, really shitty desires. But you are also kind of defending the market. Like, why are you defending the market? It's like, shouldn't we just get rid of the market? And then and he was just like, well, this is going to be controversial maybe on this panel, but I actually do think the market is like, I'm not convinced that there's any alternatives to the market that work, like central planning is. And that also led to like a lot of sneers. And I don't know, I've never asked you this. I mean, this isn't about interviewing you, Diego, but I'm curious if you are you a proponent of central planning or?
So two things. Number one, Foucault is a libtard. Just to put it out there, I'm just gonna say it out there. Foucault is just another.
You can't say libtard if we
can. We say libtard on YouTube?
Yes, of course, because people will not get offended by it because
I feel very offended by that.
It.
By the way, I feel extremely offended by that.
So Foucault is just another liberal for me. And then the second thing is that the market is a historical category. Markets existed much before capitalism, and they will potentially exist after capitalism. Central planning as a straw man is not necessarily a full centralization of the economy. It's just a matter of using the powers of the market towards a social goal. So in that sense, I think... So I think it's like Deng Xiaoping described it very well by the formation of the new communist party of China. Is that saying that the market, it's a terrible master, but it's an excellent slave.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so my take is that one. I'm non-normative towards the market. I'm more positive.
So you would agree with my friend then? My friend's view was the exact same. I mean, he was obviously having this analytic framework, but he was basically like, we just need to like make the market do things that we want, like not things that we don't want.
The market thing is like, okay, how do you distribute income? How do you distribute material goods? It can only be done through the market. I don't think the, what do you call it?
What's about certain things? Certain things.
Like ownership of the means of production by associations of producers, as opposed to just a ruling class minority, is still not centralization. It's more like bottom-up control.
I agree.
Yeah, you want like democratization of the market.
There's coordination involved in planning, but it's not necessarily central planning. Central planning seems to me an extreme measure taken by what Michael Parenti called siege communism.
Mm-hmm. But yeah. So for sure, I think that's right. But it was just interesting that this discussant was like, well, we should just get rid of the market, right? And it's like, well, what does that even mean? But like,
you know what I would like to say about this, referencing our reading, saying that you believe things in your head and only saying them without action that furthers your goal is humanism and ideological and should be discarded.
That sounds like William James or something like that. How is that different from pragmatism?
You know what? It is pragmatic to not be a moralist as a Marxist. It's something that I beg for Marxists to learn, but for, as in this story, sneering at other academics' opinions on a panel that is just opinions, for the simple reason that a single opinion on an academic panel or an academic podcast for that matter, it's an illusion with respect to reality. And I love Althusser, whose Marxist bona fides are not in doubt. I love how he lays that out. But wait, that's in like what, 20 pages before we get there?
We'll like 20 pages, yeah.
I'll try to drop some pragmatism bombs on it.
All right, we are on the next one. I'm not sure which number this is, 3 of Althusser. And this is the one that Althusser is known for. So I'm going to attach it to the thingy thing if you want to read along. It's not that hard. Kind of long, but, very manageable.
It's like 50 pages of relatively clear writing.
Yeah, and especially,
This is the essay that he's most publicly known for. And when ideology is used, if it's being used correctly, which is rare, but if ideology, the term, is being used in its terminological context, it comes from this essay.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely a very influential, it's his most developed description, I would say, of like his definition of ideology that then gets picked up by a lot of different people, including Zizek, I think.
And that's sort of a reference to that letter Engels wrote where he said, it's not that the base determines the superstructure, but that it's in the last instance, the base determines the superstructure. So there is, relative autonomy in the superstructure, and there is a kind of even mutual determination between the base and the superstructure, but it's just in the last instance, you have this sort of primary level of determination, and then you have these derivative levels.
You can tell he's talking to Marxists because he says about 10 times, "Hey, I'm not getting rid of base and superstructure. I'm not getting rid of it. Don't worry. No. I'm just updating it.
Yeah.
I'm just updating one part of it that might need updating, perhaps."
Yeah, adding something carefully.
Just for context here, this is it's written 6 years after our previous reading in 1970. So interestingly, this is post 1968, which was a big year for the PCF, or a very small year for the PCF, depending on your proclivity, but also pre-wife strangle in Althusser's arc here. Can I say that on YouTube?
Yeah.
Strangulation.
I don't know. We'll never know. We don't own it. That's why we will never know. It's all in the hands of the capitalists, Pills. That's the problem.
As long as it's descriptive and not imperative.
So where do we start with this? With the definition of ideology he states at the beginning. And it's true that he's very careful about you going back to the Marxist language. He reframes everything using Marxist terminology. But then he also tries, in a way, to build upon it, to give his definition, moving from descriptive theory to actual theory about ideology.
Yeah. Well, we have a few things to get into because it's like heavy on the Marxist terminology, which might be alienating to our audience.
I find that stuff fun.
Yeah.
Oh, shut up. And then the Freud stuff gets dropped in there too. But we're going through like means of production versus productive forces versus relations of production.
There's a lot of shit.
I don't know if we go through all that or just start at the end and say what ideology is.
Maybe just to give a framework, starting with the first part about the relationship between material basis and ideological superstructures, and how he's changing this from the traditional Marxist tradition.
Yeah, that sounds like a good place to start, because he's really clear throughout about two things. First, he is not intending to deviate from Marx. He frames this as a clarification. Some Marxists may disagree, but that's what he's framing it as. And the other thing that reads here as subtext is that he thinks that Marxists generally, or many of them, are wrong to think that the base determines the superstructure in a one-to-one equivalent causation. There is causation there, clearly, but it's not billiard ball A to B causation. This is against a kind of determinism that says ideology is not reciprocally causal or effectual.
Yeah, and even just like very basically, because of our last episode, right, we were reading some stuff on Marxism and humanism. And so he was defining ideology there in terms of like humanism. Humanism is an ideology. Okay, so now what is an ideology? Well, this isn't what an ideology is. It's a system of representations. It's part of the superstructure, but it kind of permeates the social whole. And it's very important. Every society has one. It's ahistorical in that sense, but it appears differently. So you have capitalist ruling class ideology is something historically specific. In this one that we're reading now, he adds this idea of ideological state apparatus, and he's instead trying to answer the question, sort of not what is humanism as an ideology and how does Marx break away from that in his later writing. But in here, he's talking about reproduction specifically, not biological reproduction, but reproduction of the conditions of production. So, like to me, it's like, you read Capital Volume 1 and you get this overview of capitalist production and you stop there, right? You don't read Volume 2, you don't read Volume 3. You just look at everything from the standpoint of production. He seems to be saying here that this is not going to be very helpful, right? You're definitely going to fall into a base structure determinism.
Yep.
And in another way, you're very close to what bourgeois economists, how they view. They take the perspective of like a single firm, right? They'll go into and look at everything from the perspective of, I don't know, fucking Walmart or something, like the single firm. And they won't sort of rise up to the level of the reproduction of production, like how as society is producing, it is also reproducing the conditions that allow it to keep producing. Because if it didn't do that, this production would grind to a halt and everything would fall to bits. And ideology is a fundamental part of that reproductive cycle, how the conditions of production are reproduced from day to day, generation to generation, and so on. That gets done largely through ideology and the ideological state apparatuses. That's my best way of sort of how I would like open this and connect it to what we talked about last time.
Thank you, Eric. If I can try to make another connection just to help, build the table that we're talking over. When you say this economy, there's the real economy, but then as we talked about with French sociology, I'm talking Durkheim, Mauss, Bataille picked up on this. There's also sort of a faith or a belief economy. And I think if you gel these two things together, they kind of fit quite nicely. Because in the same way that there's no society without ideology, Durkheim said there's no society without religion. And religion, again, if you're just hearing this for the first time, it's a broad sense. Like the way we believe in religion or God is actually a displaced belief that we have in the people around us, other people. So religion and ideology, we can say, both reflect society's collective aspects. But for Althusser, as opposed to Durkheim, for Althusser, we have to look at the economy, who's building what, who owns what, where the stuff's coming from. All of that matters more than, I don't know, Durkheim's humans were sitting around a fire and suddenly felt effervescent towards each other.
Yeah, like Durkheim is a sociologist, and you could say his view is like sociologism.
They complement each other, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he gets stuff right, but like he kind of looks at the gift economy, but not really how, production gets done.
But I think connecting to this reading that you guys gave, I didn't participate, but I was listening to the episode about the gift economy and this notion of debt, of social debt. In a way, it's a material relation on the world that it's explained with an imaginary layer that reproduces it, the basis that creates that imaginary layer. So you give a gift physically, materially, you give somebody something, and then there's a layer of imagination that explains that relationship, creates a story or an explanation to whatever happened, and the story itself leads to the reproduction of the material act of giving a gift and owning something in return. So I think that in a way, it's a good example to explain the relationship between material basis and ideological superstructure and the role of ideology, because ideology always wants to reproduce those material conditions from which it emerged, for a sense of perpetuation. But then again, what is interesting for people to understand in this text is that what Althusser is saying is that ideology is just not pure ideas. It's just not empty imagination. It's not necessarily that. What he's saying is that ideology, it's a non-material physical aspect of the world.
Yeah, it's embedded in practice.
It's embedded in practice, exactly.
That's a great example, because you get a real gift and now you're in debt in the gift economy, but debt's not real. Like, no debt is really real.
Well, yeah.
It's part of the ideological structure. It's a number with a minus sign in front of it. Yeah, however, even though it's not real, it has real effects. Like, if you have debt, you have to pay more real interest on loans, or you go to real debtor's prison, or real indentured servitude that you're sold into. So ideological concepts might not exist empirically in the sense that they're not anywhere, but they do have real effects.
So, I mean, gift giving is a kind of ideology there, because it's both the source of social cohesion and conflict, right? So insofar as gift giving creates competition, right? Whoever gives the bigger, better gift, whoever can't return the gift is, then sort of identified as like, lower material wealth equals sort of social wealth. You're identified as like a lower position. And the obligation to return the gift, the obligation, the debt, the obligation also creates how that cycle reproduces itself. You're obliged now to do something, Or again, you will have committed some kind of social faux pas if you don't give back the gifts. And we talked about kind of the weak modern versions of this, like around Christmas time or birthdays and like those sorts of very different kinds and not so fundamental forms of gift giving that still are around today.
So a gift giving society is going to give birth to a gift giving ideology.
Yeah. It'll get the ideology it deserves.
And the obligations to give will reproduce your need to go to Walmart and buy
shit,
buy more Hot Wheels. Yeah. Do you guys want to start to, like, we can do ideology. The title is Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, but I think the easiest way to jump into this would be to talk about school, because he says in the Middle Ages, this is a standard like epochal narrative. In the Middle Ages, the church was the dominant ideological state apparatus, the church and the family. And now it's the school and the family in the 70s. And interestingly, he brings up the communications media, which I'm going to suspect is replace the school. I don't even know if that's debatable.
Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, I mean, there's some really basic vocabulary that I think everybody could easily get their head around, because it's just sort of also the structure of this essay, right? Like, you see how the first section, after the little intro part there, the first section is the reproduction of the means of production. And then the second section is called the reproduction of labor power. So he's adopted his point of view, say, okay, instead of just taking the point of view of production, I'm going to take the point of view of the reproduction of the conditions of production. So, okay, how does the reproduction, what's the reproduction of the means of production? Okay, so you have, the basic Marxist vocabulary, right? I always just put very simply, mode of production equals forces of production plus relations of production. That's all you really need. So that's the first two sections are about the forces of production. On the one hand, the forces of production are the means. So the building that you're doing your work in, the machines, the raw materials, all the means of production. And then the second part about labor power, that's the other part of the forces of production, right? So the forces of production are the means of production together with the labor power. So the second part is, how does labor power get reproduced? Well, it's also reproduced outside of the firm, just as the capitalist business owner, doesn't magically conjure their buildings and tools and materials out of nothing. They need other capitalists. So you kind of have to look at the social whole and how all that gets done. Labor power, you give them a wage, and then they go outside of the firm to the market, to the Apple store, wherever they want to go, and they buy the necessities of their life, right? But then there's also more. Beyond this sort of need, there's the education system that Pills was just bringing up.
That was a really good job of summarizing that quickly. I had to make a whole graph out of it.
Yeah, I had to awesome. Too. I'm reading off of a lot of I make a lot of like kind of diagram type notes. So I'm just kind of reading off of my notes, right? So the other way is through education and stuff.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, or I'm sorry I interrupted, but tell me forces of production and school, how do they relate?
Well, the way I broke it down was that the forces of production break down into two categories. So the means of production and labor power. So remember the whole thing, mode of production equals forces plus relations of production. Forces then further break down into two subcategories here, means of production, which are like the material conditions, and labor power. And so the way labor power gets reproduced is, yes, one through wages, and there's a historically shifting minimum. You can look at like the basket of goods and how much that costs. And, if we get into a trade war with China, oh shit, we're going to have to pay workers more because they can't afford food quite so cheaply, et cetera. And then you also have to teach the workers two things, know-how and to follow the rules. And also those things need to be there in the reproduction of labor power. So where do those things get done? In the school system.
Can I just add one little detail? That would also explain why different public policies relate to abortion. You know, as in a way, you can say that the reduction of salary and the dignity of workers could lead potentially to repression of reproduction, of biological reproduction. So in a way, states are not necessarily interested in limiting the biological reproduction of the workforce. So that's why in the end, abortion politics or policy is more related to the availability of hand labor.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure I see that connection.
That sounds pretty wild to me.
I don't know if it's always like a population control thing, but it could be.
No, let's not even go there. I don't know how you're going to provide evidence for that, but most of the world's capitalist, and in every one of the world's most capitalist states, except for one, many of those states also risk population decline. And in none of those states is there any debate over abortion, or very little, relatively. There's one weird edge case, and I don't want to go there with you, Diego, unless you can lay down some other evidence. But otherwise, it sounds paranoid with respect to reproduction.
Yeah.
But still, on that point, a main theme of this text is about the reproduction of production. And mostly this is about ideas and practices. That's what ideology is. But he does also speak of the proletariat has to reproduce itself, which is the reason that they have a minimum wage at all. You have to pay them enough so that they can have kids, because otherwise your workforce will die.
Yeah.
So if you want to,
the state comes in and legislates.
No. What I meant is that states will not legalize abortion because it's an anti-self reproduction policy. You see, like, for example, if they legalize abortion and salaries are going down, like, it's normal that people are going to use different alternatives, anti-conception alternatives, not to reproduce themselves because their lives have no viable reproducibility. That's what I'm saying. Is that in the end, like, for example, if capitalists get to the point where they say there's like a problem with salaries because of offer and demand of skilled labor and salaries, they will not go towards the parts of abortion because they need more people competing for fewer jobs so they can accept lower salaries.
I love a conspiracy, though, as much as the next guy, but it's legal on request in pretty much every advanced capitalist country in the world, except one.
See, I would probably locate this debate more in the like religious ideological state apparatus, because the perception that allowing abortion is more progressive or even socialist, whereas denying abortion is more conservative and traditionalist. One that seems to pivot a lot on like a religious kind of debate, but also economic freedom. And like when we get to critiques of Althusser, right, like his whole thing about reproduction, just to throw it out quickly, ignores like the unpaid labor of women, right, which becomes a very important part of like feminist Marxism and like post-60s Marxism. Is like, okay, well, hold on, like this reproduction of the means of production, the mode of production, is not just ideological. I mean, there's people who are outside the wage labor system who aren't getting paid wages, still dependent on the market, but they are indispensable for the reproduction of the conditions of production, aka, household labor, women's labor, work that is not valued. So, and Althusser doesn't go there with this. And so you couldn't talk about abortion without bringing that kind of social control dimension into it.
I'm not saying otherwise. What I just wanted to add is, like, look at the coincidence, in the sense that stagnant wages have been there since the 60s, and productivity and the amount of goods we produce, like the efficiency of skilled labor, has been going up since the same time, right? But minimum salaries are stagnated. In a way, it's mostly because we introduce a mostly unpaid cost of labor to the actual workforce, in the sense that before that, women were doing unpaid labor indirectly, but they were accounted for in the salary for the necessary reproduction of the labor. Now they're accounted for, so they're being paid. So what the man used to make double before under lower production that was used to sustain the whole household, now it's just like you guys are saying, you're moving in with your girlfriends and you broke up with your girlfriend and you need a smaller apartment. You see, so it was considered under the necessary material means for the reproduction of the workforce. It's just so undermined by ideology that we get lost talking about religion and everything. But in the end, it's much more practical than that. It's much more factual and material than that.
All right. I have to think about that more, but I
have to think about that too.
You take your dual income point. Yeah. After World War I, World War II, and women enter the workforce. Yeah. There's definitely something to say there. We're also diverging from, we were just about to get to education. Well,
we're diverging a bit, but I guess just one quick thing on that, because it seems like where Diego's coming from is like to give a material explanation for like abortion, right? And then I guess like I'm just wondering, like, well, maybe is that always the best explanation? Like, I don't know, because I'm kind of wondering if there's, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I misunderstood you, Diego, but I was like,
suggest it has an ideological component.
Yes, it's an ideological. Yes.
I actually don't think so. I think it's the opposite, because abortion, sex education, which happens in schools, birth control, all of this is good for capitalism. Because back in the day, if a girl has a kid at 17, 18, no problem, because she's got her mom and all the other women at home to raise the kid. The reason you need abortion and sex education is because if a girl has a kid at 17, 18, now you've just lost a worker for life, basically. Plus all the women that were at home, 80 years ago, now they're all out working too. So there's no one to raise the kid. So I'm going to say that birth control is more ideological than banning abortion. That seems like a weird conflict. I don't have a theory on what it is, on what that actually is, except some weird like sovereign society hangover that's returning in a reactionary sense.
What I think Althusser is in a way framing here is that the mix between the throne and the altar, like family and church, it's more like a sovereign society paradigm. And then when we talk about family and schools, is the disciplinary society paradigm. But what would be interesting to say is that how much these state ideological apparatuses are closer to to control societies from a Deleuzian point of view, where we are no longer treated as individuals, but as individuals. But only certain aspects of you are interesting to only certain systems of control.
Okay, let me just play host here. We're doing a lot of dropping and not a lot of explicating. So if we can just return to the text and do some step-by-step.
Sorry.
We're talking about ideological state apparatuses here, and I just want to read the list of examples that he gives, because we've mentioned a bunch of them already. The educational apparatus, that's school, university system. The religious apparatus, that one's on the decline. The family apparatus, I think that one's always like front and center. Although with the family apparatus, what you said before, basically in the 50s, a married couple would be treated as a unit. And because of what Eric just said and the Deleuze thing, the functional differentiation turns the husband and wife each into individuals. And there's like practical benefits, practical drawbacks to that. Like it's not a moral claim I'm making, but it also treats them as now individuals. We haven't got there with children yet in most, in our country, at least. Some states are, pulling back on those child labor laws. But the family apparatus, part of its dissolution or its loss of power is by splitting the couple up, which is why real wages also go down. Anyway, sorry, still on my list. The political apparatus, that's elections and stuff. He gives a nice explanation about why you'd think that's in charge, but it's really just bullshit. The trade union apparatus, obviously, is in the 70s. That mattered.
Oh, yeah.
Fuck. The communications apparatus, that one's obviously on the rise. He just speaks of radio and TV. And then the cultural apparatus, quote unquote, I don't know what that is. The fashion industry, shit like that.
He says literature, sports, and arts.
Okay. And he's
Yeah.
got some dumb takes, like sports are just like chauvinism on display.
Yeah.
Kind of, but
Oh, what else are the Olympics other than a chance for the whole world to humiliate themselves against
Yeah, that
the
was
US
weird.
every few
That
years?
came out of nowhere. Yeah.
I don't know why they insist on participating in these things, but it's just a chance for the states to be like, hey, look how much better we are. Look how much more money we have, in other words.
Okay, there's your local Marxist on what sports are about.
I
I don't like the sports ball. You
Sports are
stupid idiots.
chauvinistic. Yeah.
Yeah, fuck them. Sorry.
Okay,
Yes.
so
good.
the
Now
school,
that we have named all the ideological apparatuses.
yeah, 1970s.
Yes.
He says the schools replaced the old ones, which were the church and family dominant. Now schools dominant. And one of the one times Peterson said an argument that I agreed with. He said, "Do you know that our school system is based on the Prussian military system of everybody sitting down, and if you don't behave, you get beaten? That's what our school system is based on. I can't believe." So he was right about one thing, but guess what? He stole it from a postmodern neo-Marxist.
He loves it. Well, just to fill in a little more on the reading here for those who are following along. So that list, those are obviously examples of ideological state apparatuses. And then he's like, but in order to talk about the reproduction of the relations of production, that other part of the formula, I'm going to need to give you a Marxist theory of society. And that's when he goes into the base and the superstructures. So it just boils down to three. He says he can reduce it very, very reductively to three elements: the economy, the law and the state, and ideology. Those are the three parts. You have the base, the economic base, sometimes also called the infrastructure, and you have the superstructure, which have those other two things: law and the state, that's one, political, legal, and the other thing, ideology, which and the ideology is where he's going to say, okay, the state is, the state apparatus. And actually, we're all familiar with the repressive state apparatus, the military, the police, the judicial system, anything that exerts violence and coercion and forces you to do things. And then you have the other side, the side that works on your mind, the side that works on your beliefs, the side that indoctrinates you into the ideological order, which is the ideological state apparatus, which consists of those institutions that Pills just listed.
And we said he read Lacan, right? Economy, legal system, ideology, real, symbolic, imaginary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unconscious, and conscious. I guess
hopefully we're going to get there, because that's the
upper level.
Yeah, that's the cool part of the reading. There's something I wanted to read to add to the conversation. I'm sorry, I'm going to make the simultaneous translation while I'm reading.
Which that's incredible that you can do that. He's saying he's reading in Spanish and speaking in English.
Yeah,
that's
that's
incredible.
weird. So just to make the distinction between the state, the state's repression, and the ideological repression of the state's apparatus. So he says, we can prove that while the repressive apparatus of the state belongs entirely to the public domain, for the most part, the ideological state apparatus belongs to the private domain. And then he goes on to say, the state itself is beyond the judiciary. The state belongs to the dominant class. It is not public nor private. On the contrary, is the condition of the distinction between private and public. The repressive apparatus of the state functions through violence, and the ideological state apparatus functions through ideology.
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, so the two different apparatuses.
Yeah, we think of the state as like the police, and that's true. It's the police and the laws, but the ideology is how you are taught to control yourself. Your self-control, which makes it it's not a bad thing.
No,
you want other people to have self-control around you, but
you don't want people to depend on the existence of police to behave. It's like this critique that people make on Christian fundamentalists, when you say, the only reason I don't kill people is because it's a sin, right? So, man, you're an asshole, right? Like you should know better than to kill somebody else. But in a way, all ideologies behave like that. We just don't see ourselves as parts of ideology, but we are always already in ideology.
I keep going back to this just because we covered it already. But Durkheim basically says God is other people. So in that sense, it's true. Without God, everything is permitted. But if a theist says without God, everything is permitted, well, then you just found yourself a psychopath.
But how is that different from somebody saying, I just don't kill people because that's a crime?
Yeah, like the law.
It's the same. And but then again, some people will say, I don't kill people because I believe in Kant deontology. It's the same thing. You're just using a master signifier to exteriorize the decision making.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's one of my problems with Kantian ethics, actually.
I don't kill people because I would feel bad if I did it.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't kill people because I'm weak. Yeah,
I only kill people if there's something to gain from it.
Okay, you know what? We're gonna be fucked off YouTube again for this.
Sorry. Yeah.
They're inciting.
I don't kill people because I don't want to work for YouTube. That's it. That's a reality. That's a material reality determined by material conditions. You see?
The algorithm says they said kill too many times.
I don't kill people because I don't want to get censored. That's it. That's the reality.
I don't talk about it. Then it's ideology. I just keep it in my head. Then it's real.
You know, Lacan was right about that one. If God exists, everything is permitted.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, those are all important points. Yes, like how do you differentiate between the state apparatus that is repressive and the state apparatus that is ideological? Well, the repressive one is public, and the repressive one operates by violence. The ideological one is private, and the ideological one operates or functions by way of ideology. Big surprise. And then the state itself, which is above the law, I am the state, as one king famously said, and which the next president may also probably say, is above the law, right? And it's a distinction internal to bourgeois law that makes the difference between private, a privately owned place where different rules apply, and then the public sphere where the police prowl, right? And then also that very, very important distinction between state power and state apparatus, right? So the point of class struggle is to seize the power over the state. And the power over the state, which is in the hands of the ruling class, is exerted through, on the one hand, the ideological, the ISAs and the RSAs. I'm just going to say the letters to make it
so
short.
It's because of the dialectical overcoming of feudalism that church gave ideological justification to the divine right of kings, that we need schools to give ideological justification to the currently existing material relationships.
Yeah, different. That would be our legitimacy discussions we've had in the past. Where does the legitimacy of the state come from? Well, now it's a kind of ideological upbringing that's been put onto the education system to inculcate a sense of where legitimacy comes from. And, then we select our intellectual history for that. Oh, well, it goes back to Hobbes. And then Locke had something very important to say. Yeah. And then you have Montesquieu, and then you have blah, blah, blah. And then we get, that's what legitimacy is. Cool. And
I mean, I think that in education, we tell a story about how the state came about. And I think there's a historical reason, although I don't think the story, Hobbes's point, though, I guess the only thing I would say is more actually none of this is about, none of this is actually about, democracy, obviously, but neither is it really even about divine right of kings. I mean, he was controversial for kind of saying, the reason you want to obey and you should obey a king is because you want to be safe. And it's the only thing so which was kind of a material, it's actually kind of a material argument in a way. It's just you're not, it's going to be chaos, and it's not going to be chaos in the sense of war, a literal war against all. When a lot of people misread him, I think, and think, oh, he's describing this war of all against all as a literal war, but it's more just that when you're alone without some kind of overarching power, there's always a chance that something could come about and you're not going to have any recourse at all to deal with it. It's just going to be kind of psychological chaos in a certain sense.
You're anxious because it's not the purge, but it could be.
You're anxious because it could be at any second a purge, and you're not going to have any recourse. Yeah, we could maybe argue that that's ideological. I don't actually know, but then it's like later the stories that we tell about like the king, oh, he's like, the descendant from Jesus or whatever, or like democracy and freedom are the reasons we, are the things that make the state legitimate or whatever. I think there's also another kind of ideological story.
But every state, like ideologically, every state is going to have a repressive structure that stops people from killing themselves, because if there's too many people dead, then they can't keep producing stuff.
Exactly.
Until you get enough people, and then you need to go to war to, cut some off the top.
Yeah, like this is what the repressive state apparatus is for. I mean, repressive obviously has like a negative connotation, but like, what is it?
Just
like
the threat of
John
force.
Stuart Mills and like kind of the theory of like harm and like, the limitations on freedom and those sorts of things. If your freedom infringes on somebody else's freedom, the state apparatus is there to resolve your disputes. Violence is no longer, something done on the streets of Florence anymore with a dagger, but now it's done in courtrooms with the judicial system. And it's all this big unified state. Like we often identify the state with the repressive state apparatus. And he says there's a kind of singularity there. The repressive state apparatus is one, but the ideological state apparatus is a plurality. It encompasses all these different, often private institutions in which the ideological functions are often different and contradictory, but they also have a kind of unity, which is a unity conferred upon it by the ruling class ideology and those who possess actual state power.
It's like 400 years before, but Hobbes is kind of just saying, hey, my ideology is better than the other one. Like all these other people are saying, society is because God wants us to be in a society. And he just goes, you know what? I have a better story for you that doesn't involve God. But he also knows that this war of all against all, he's not like lying that it's real. He's saying, okay, here's my ideological thought experiment for you. If you didn't have this is what you'd have instead, which is like a justification for the status quo, which he wants a king. He's a monarchist there.
Well, it's also a justification for, like, it's also in the context of like not wanting any more civil wars in England to happen and stop fighting about religion. This isn't about religion. This is just about safety.
Well, there you go. It was because the ideology of God was disrupting the forces of production. Then we need a new one, a new ideology. So we invent the ideology of freedom and reason. And hey, look, the workers are back at work. So that's why this new modern ideology won out in the evolutionary struggle.
But see, he's met, this is the weird part about when we start thinking about ideology, is that we're like in it already and it's so self-reflexive, and we're going to get into mirrors later, don't worry. But I think what Hobbes is really describing is like the birth of kind of like the repressive state apparatus. As I think the basic point there is like, you have to give up to the sovereign that power you would normally claim as your right to say, defend yourself and attack other people and all that. You by electing a sovereign, or by sort of signing the social contract kind of thing metaphorically, you're giving up that sort of right of exerting direct force over other people to some kind of abstract state powers,
which is also ideology, that you begin in this free state.
That is like from within ideology, but he's not exactly describing like an ideological state apparatus as a key part of the functioning of the state, much less of the reproduction.
Well, in a way,
of like the social whole.
No, I think he's self-conscious by saying, "Here, I'm going to tell you this story.
Totally.
I'm going to justify this using a myth that I just made up." I think that part is self-consciously ideological.
Yeah, I agree.
That's why I think we need Lacan on top of Freud to explain the relationship between the subject and ideology in Althusser. What do I mean by this? Like, because one statement that Althusser does, I don't know how it's written in English, but in Spanish it says the subject is naturally ideological. Like human nature, the human nature of the subject is to be ideological. But he says ideological in a contingent dialectical way, not in a transcendental way. Because this was the speech made by Lacan in Germany that I was telling you guys about. Like, the fight between Lacan and the American school of the transcendental ego, I always forget the name, is not saying that there's a transcendental ego that is prior to social societies and social formations, but ego as subject as an ideological predisposition is constituted by the relationship between material basis and ideological superstructures. So there's no such thing as a previous subject. So even Hobbes, or when we're talking about the subject of ideology, the subject is subject to ideology, sujet à. And we go into interpellation and the need to be named by others and the need to be, ruled by a king and to be put in a societal place by an external Archimedean point that is telling you your place in society. So subject is subject to ideology, is not subject before ideology. The subject is already into ideology.
I agree with that. I think, though, if we can kind of read this Althusser account of the ideological state apparatus and then relate it to Hobbes, I think maybe the point you could say, it's not about a subject existing pre-ideology, but more that the type of ideology that Althusser is talking about that helps reinforce the relations of production would not be possible unless you have the repressive state first, in a sense, because it's not going to do anything. If you're just if there's no state, you can't have that kind of ideology that we're talking about really work, because it has to be backed by there has to be something backing it, I think.
Yeah.
Right. So
Hobbesian theory would be completely irrelevant during in Egypt.
Yeah, because you wouldn't ideologically assume that individuals start with freedom or that individuals even exist. Only the pharaoh exists.
There's no individuals before Descartes. This is Lacan's point.
All of this stuff, what we call the state, in this sense, he calls it the capitalist state. It might have precursors immediately before, but the individual, the ISAs, the RSAs, all of these come into existence at exactly the same time. They're all like each other's flip side, and they're
correct. Mm-hmm.
As a result of this, the hail. I don't know if we're ready to get to the hail yet.
I guess we can transition into talking about interpellation and all that, but just Freud's example of when you're expecting a child, right? So we're always already subjects constituted by ideology. And he says a simple example of okay, how can you be a subject sort of before you're an individual? How does that happen? And he sort of brings up Freud and says, well, Freud points this out by saying, well, when you're expecting a child, you almost have their name and their identity ready for them. And you're just waiting for the kid to show up. And that's the social contract, right? You have the place for the sovereign. Hobbes has drawn a big circle around it. There it is. We're just waiting for the person to be there. It doesn't matter who it is. You just need someone invested with that power. They can be anybody. So they're sort of already interpellated, I guess, as a subject. It's already there. I guess you could say it in that way. Freud's example is about, expecting a child, but I don't know.
Do we have time to go into this? Because that's the second longer part of the conversation, that's saying that the ideology doesn't have history. Because that will get us into a very ontological discussion.
I was going to just talk about gender reveal parties. I don't know if you want to go to...
Well, that would carry on nicely from what I just said.
I was just going to say an example I think would be useful. We're talking about a lot, we're using a lot of big jargony words and describing these different forces. So I think any sort of discussion of examples, I think, is a good idea.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I thought it was kind of self-evident, but what I meant, here's another way to put it. You know, the popular reactionary pivot right now is whining about gender ideology.
Yes.
So they get gender ideology right, but also don't understand why they're getting it right. Because to them, gender ideology, I guess, just means trans stuff. But they forget it's not only trans people that have genders. Go figure. And it's just plain as facts that if you look at any culture of any time, what your gender is kind of different in the sense that it determines what you can do in that culture. And gender is not the only attribute. obviously, other attributes await you as well from before you're born, like your class or your birth order in the family. Like the oldest aristocrat boy inherits the farm, so the second boy has to go into the clergy or the army. These are like determinate paths that are assigned to you before you even exist. And so it's obvious just by the fact that different cultures have different conditions for your life based on these attributes, they can't be necessary. Now, we assume a bunch of things that aren't really real here. Just like debt at the beginning, we said debt isn't really real, but it still has real effects.
Yeah.
Like that, your freedom isn't really real. And gender, class, birth order, those are the kinds of things that are attached to that, not really real, but has real effects. And you can illustrate that by saying, now there existed not that long ago a cause and effect relation that said, if you are born first and have a dick, you will then inherit the farm. Now, I don't know how anyone, including these gender panic dudes on the internet, could deny that that is ideological.
Yep.
There's no natural causation that links dick having to farm inheriting. And yet, ideology makes it so. That's gender ideology. Now, I'm yammering on a little bit, but this isn't exactly what interpellation is. Can someone explain what interpellation is?
Who's doing it? Am I going to do it?
Go ahead, Victor. Interpellation is a Lacanian concept.
Yeah, well, isn't it this idea that like you're kind of like hailed, you're addressed by ideology, like so like that it somehow it subjectivizes you. So like I think there's an example about like when a police officer calls out like, "Hey, you there?" and then someone like responds to them, they implicitly accept the identification as a subject of the call. So like, it's kind of like so ideology operates, I guess, as like somehow like you're like that, like you like your place in relation to this idea, like in this case of like police having an authority, and then like your response to it, you're being interpolated by that, like I guess ideological. That's how I understand it. Yep. And like your response to it somehow recognizing it is like you being addressed by ideology, and then you becoming sort of participating in it. It's like that process is interpellation, was my understanding.
What always helps me with this is that in like the French je m'appelle, like you cannot name yourself. You have to be named by someone else, by an authority.
So like you being a citizen, it's like of a country is like an interpellation of I guess, right? Of being
in
like...
Spanish, in Spanish, subject is sujeto a. So I'm subject to. I'm subject to something.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a verb equivalent to appeler in Spanish?
Me llamo. But the word appeal to, like I appeal to something. Je m'appelle, appello a. So there's for sure a philological study there.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you appeal to what? You appeal to God or the court, you're calling on them. And the French verb is interesting because it's a reflexive verb, as like je me. So transliterated, it's to appeal to myself as pills.
Yeah. You see, that's why I think it's cool that I can read this in Spanish and then we can have the conversation in English.
Yeah,
because I think a lot of the terminology becomes so enriched by mistranslating or trying to translate.
Yeah, or like cutting the difference between different ways of translating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting.
Yeah, both Spanish and French have these reflexive verbs, and English is just I am. I am pills. It's an ontological identity declared.
Yeah. Look, I have it here in ancient Mayan. In ancient Mayan, people introduce themselves as, when you ask, who are you? You ask Chimirihuaca. But Chimirihuaca is, where are you from? Like when they get in touch with the Spanish colonialists, they change the sentence to Chimirihuaca tú. Like tú is you. So they added the Spanish word you at the end of the sentence to make it individual. Because before that, the subject was collective. You were only subject to a collective participation.
First address, there's not even a subject of the sentence, it's just where from, basically?
Yeah, exactly. There's no individual subject of the sentence to be named in the text. So this we go back to Derrida and the invention of the I as the I in grammar. The I in grammar gave birth to the individual notion of me as an individual self. It was named, it was required by language.
And that's something that Althusser is definitely picking up on here.
So,
To
I think
be
so as well.
subject in the sentence is also the subject of ideology.
Yeah, then he gives the religious. If we get down to this religious example he gives, that would be an interesting, because he does give, a Bible-centric Western kind of version of the story, but the Mayan one is also would be very interesting to compare to it. But okay, yeah, so Althusser's sort of theory of the subject, right?
Ideology is a theory of the subject. That's the key sentence.
Yeah, and he says the proposition he sets down is there is no ideology except by the subject and for subjects, by the people and for the people. So then, his central idea is that, ideology is going to be the answer to the question, how are the conditions of production reproduced? What is the method by which, the reproduction of the conditions of production gets done is through ideology. And so how does ideology itself actually function? And it's through interpellation, which Victor gave us the rundown on the sort of example he gives of a policeman saying, "Hey, you," and you sort of not even needing to turn around, even to sort of just know that you are the subject of that hailing. And so this is Althusser's theory of the subject, which is what ideology does. It works on subjects and it works between subjects.
But I guess we can think of other examples, right? The way that you'll hear economists talking about consumers, right? Like you're a consumer, right? And it's it's addressing you like that kind of and then, and even you could even say like, oh, your responsibility as a citizen of this country, right? Like, so all these different ways, these different namings, right, are kind of have a whole ideological background that is implicit in the addressing, the interpolating.
And the conspiratorial aspect of Althusser here is that if you're in a capitalist ideology, it wants to break you down to as minute a part
molecule
as possible, because then it can extract from you. So whereas in previous modes of production, people would have identified with their family or their tribe as like, this is,
or their trait,
this is me. This is like the smallest thing I can be reducible to is my totem, my tribe. Then in capitalism, through differentiation, you are progressively individualized from your tribe, then individualized from your extended family, and then ultimately individuated from your spouse, and then even from yourself, as you're broken into different categories. And I think this is quite simply because it's more efficient to extract value from pieces than from these nebulous large bodies, which sounds like conspiracy, and it kind of is. But it's just like a machinic conspiracy. It's differentiation is more efficient.
I brought up that point last week where, ideology isn't in us. We as subjects are in ideology. We have to flip that around. So he says here, ideology has the function, which defines it, of constituting concrete individuals as subjects.
I was going to read the same thing.
So subjects are constitutive of ideology, but only insofar as this is ideology's function, which is to constitute subjects. So ideology constitutes subjects, and we are in ideology, not the other way around. And then he gives this interesting quote. St. Paul says, it is in the logos, meaning in ideology, that we live, move, and have our being. So there's some Bible ideology. And it's through a primary obviousness, which is what I was going to get to. This sort of obvious face value, primary obviousness, he says. It is clear, he says, you and I are subjects, we're free, we have an ethical consciousness, blah, blah, blah. Like all obviousnesses, including those that make a word name a thing or have a meaning, therefore including the obviousness of the transparency of language, the obviousness that you and I are subjects, and that does not cause any problems, is an ideological effect, the elementary ideological effect. And he even applies it to his own text here. He says, if I'm saying this about the repressive state apparatus and you're going, yeah, I agree, that's obviously how it is. You're giving me an intuitively correct description of something. It's obvious. That's an ideology effect, right? It's like the overtness of things, the overtness of meaning, the immediate perceptibility or the immediate recognition. That's where I'm going to get to anyway. Those are the functions of ideology: recognition, or
Interpellation.
a failure to recognize, misrecognizing. Yeah, well, even interpellation is kind of an ideological, an illustration, right? If somebody says, hey, in those like funny clips or something where somebody's slowly running with their arms out to like hug you, and then it turns out they're actually going to hug the person behind you and they don't want anything to do with you, like that's a misrecognition. But ideology puts that effect on you. You think they're coming to hug you, and then they sort of high five the person next to you or something.
So you mean, Eric, that commercial with the hot lady is not flirting towards me directly?
That's pure ideology, baby.
Oh my God, man. I'm so disappointed now.
Well, he pulls a Lacan here in saying that it's not truly about recognition, except insofar that all recognition is misrecognition. But if you pull off all the misrecognition, there's nothing underneath it. It's all méconnaissance.
I know that's the weird line. At work in this reaction, the reaction is like, that's obvious, that's true, clearly. At work in this reaction is the ideological recognition function, which is one of the two functions of ideology as such, the inverse being the function of misrecognition. So they're like, end quote, so they're like two sides of the same coin kind of thing. The condition of misrecognition is recognition, and the condition of recognition is that we are subjects in ideology, and we can be hailed and interpolated in that way. So misrecognition is one of the two functions, he says here. I don't know. I'm sure it's the same. I'm sure it's all the same as what Pills just said.
Well, it's another one of the things that, like, you can't do one without the other, but both are the same thing at the same time after the point at which you're recognized. So when the cop says, hey, you, and you recognize yourself, that's not that like from now on, that's yourself, but it's also not really yourself. There's no real correspondent to it.
Yeah, because again, ideology sort of operates outside of itself. It doesn't have its own, like your personal history, I guess. You're a subject, so you have your own history, right? But that is not really sort of your history. That's not internal to you. That's sort of something almost like given to you from without.
Like everything that you are is not contained in your name. That's basically, like, that's what makes it a misrecognition. Yeah. But you have to call yourself something, so then you are yourself. But there's like, I don't know, what do you include in yourself? Your entire genetic history, culture?
Yeah. We all send our DNA to those ancestry services.
Anyway, I wanted to ask, this is the first time we've probably read this in a while, but we've all probably read it before. Does everyone agree with this, or you got any like edges or critiques or things you want to follow up with here?
I don't have any major disagreements with this text from Althusser. I just think the relationship between the birth of subjectivity and ideology, it's not dialectical enough, in the sense that I think even trying to stabilize the relationship between subject and ideology, it's becoming already too essentialist.
Oh, really? You want there to be...
That's my only... Beyond that, I think it was a great text. I agree with most of it.
So you did this last week too. You're going really hard on no subject.
Yeah, man. I don't know. I've been reading too much Lacan lately, especially late Lacan, and I'm hard on this notion that I mean, I know there's no such thing as a non-subject person. It's kind of weird to say, no? But there's no such thing as a no subject person, because identification is always misidentification. There's an impossibility of conciliation between subject and object. So that gap between subject and object is what always gives birth to subjectivity, because we're unable to close the gap between the perception and the object, right? Or the being and the object. So in that sense, subjectivity is going to always already be there as this unreconcilability. But trying to stabilize ideology as logos, as epistemology, as imaginary with subjectivity, already for me, it's essentializing two things that are not necessarily equivalent.
I mean, I'm with you there, because I have to believe I'm a subject. All of us do. That's how we get around. But the subject has been used to explain so much that if you break it down, it actually, the explanations are kind of tenuous when these things are integrated into massively complex, multi-dynamic systems that you don't really need a whole subject for.
My point exactly.
Well, what confuses me is when I noticed when we were reading for Marx, when he explains ideology there, one of the first things he says is, what is the nature of this social function? So this is the earlier text. Did he change his view since then? What is the nature of this social function? To understand it, we must refer to the Marxist theory of history. The subjects of history are given human societies. So he's going to say now that, I guess, the unity, he seems to have changed his view then. I don't know. Subjects of history are given human societies. Okay, so the subjects that he's talking about here, who are interpolating individuals as subjects, again, what does subject mean in this sense then? Does it mean an individual person with an internal psychological life that's separate from other individuals who have their own internal? Like, and then we have to go into just sort of psychology to say anything else? Or is a subject really like a whole society, and individual subjects are like little fragments or microcosms of that?
He's talking about two different disciplines. This discipline in this reading is psychoanalysis. So this is the subject of psychoanalysis. But in the Humanism and Marx book, he was talking about history as a science. So the subject of history as a science is not humans. It's societies. That's the lowest you can go to explain anything relevant is a society, not humans.
You're going to go to individuals.
So is there a kind of a misfit between these two things then?
No, this is a subject, something with subjecthood. And in that case, it's the subject of a discipline, which is the science of history.
Oh, a subject of a discipline.
Did Althusser had something directly against Hegel?
He fucking hated him.
Yeah,
he hated him.
He said he corrupted Marx in his youth.
Yeah, he says Marx was never a Hegelian. He says, and
that's why,
he's
man.
Adamant.
That's why I think the mistranslation of capital from German to Spanish, touched by Althusser, it's a real giveaway of Althusser trying to construct an epistemological break between Hegel and Marx, which is not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to leave that for another day.
But he does say here, Hegel is an admirable theoretician of ideology insofar as he is a theoretician of universal recognition. Right. And he goes on a bit. I'm just cutting the end off of that. But yeah, so Hegel and Spinoza and Freud all make a grand appearance in this ISA essay. And Hegel is the recognition guy.
Victor, did you have any thoughts on the reading?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not too sure about what Diego said with the, I always get a bit stuck on, because I always see Lacan as giving, I see him as giving a theory of the subject. So I don't know, sometimes I get confused about what we mean by like death of the subject, right? Versus an account of kind of the mechanisms, or which to me just seems like an account of the subject. But anyway, so I guess setting that aside, I don't know, maybe for another time discussion.
It's a big one for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's a huge one. And it's something that kind of comes up for me from time to time on this podcast. I don't know. I mean, I've always liked this essay. I've always felt like, insofar as when I was kind of in undergrad and Zizek was like, on early YouTube, and I was fascinated by him. I think when I eventually came to this essay, I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, it's kind of, somehow like speaking to, although they're not identical, right? But somehow speaking to what Zizek was talking about. So I've always been a fan of this. I think like when it comes to how ideology fits in with like capitalism, I guess like my one hesitation is, which I don't even necessarily know that Althusser would disagree with me, is just like the way in which ideology really is just like a spontaneous formation of that, like may not be motivated, right? Like, because I think there can be a temptation to read it as conspiratorial, like motivated. It's like, oh, this is here for this purpose of like, it's always for the purpose of like reproducing capital. But I think like sometimes when you have ideology layered onto ideology, it kind of loses its function. It's just kind of like so many steps away from like whatever that like, I think, I don't even know if he would, like I said, I don't know that he would disagree with me, but it seems like less, I guess I think about it as like less for a purpose. And that's what I mean by conspiratorial. It's like, oh, it's here to like make sure that this stays the same. And I'm like, I'm just not always sure. I feel like sometimes it's just nonsensical.
I am so glad that was your impression, because that was exactly my I haven't read this in probably like, I don't know, 5 years. I didn't have this feeling last time. But like I said last week, it felt like there was no chance in here. There's no randomness. It's like everything. Yeah, exactly. Everything is, that's like you said, everything is paranoiacally conspiring to reproduce.
I don't like that.
Which is, a lot of it
partly
probably
true.
is.
Partly true.
But when we were talking about religion in Bataille and religion in Maus, they always had this like surplus of belief, this excessive belief that is like stupid, causeless. It explains Taylor Swift and explains wrestling and like and believing in things that are false. Like this surplus belief explains that, whereas it doesn't really have an ideological function, unless you're just saying the only purpose of all that surplus is to distract from anyone looking at the economy. That might fit. But I agree. I think that it's good, but it's leaving some of the fun stuff that we've already just done in the last 2 weeks out. I just think that there is a certain kind of way in which, and I don't necessarily know if you were doing this before, Diego, when you were talking about abortion, but since it's in my mind, I'm just going to use it as an example.
Go.
It's like, they're like, maybe like this kind of reading could invite us to like, to always have some kind of story that it's like, oh, the reason we're arguing about this is because of like, they're trying to divide us and they're actually just protecting us. And it's like, no, like sometimes it just happens out of randomness and it's just like bullshit. It's just, there's no reason.
Well, I think
it's like the snarkiness of describing being a sports fan as chauvinism. Like it might even be 50%. It might even be 80%, but it's certainly not all that.
Harmless entertainment.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh?
I think in the defense of non-determinism. In the defense of non-determinism is that things change. So ideological apparatuses are definitely not enough to reproduce the material bases that produce them. So in that sense, I agree 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Most of times out of mistakes, very little times out of the intention of ideologies.
Exactly.
So I think I agree with you. I think even the explanation to over ideologize explanations is already within ideology. So that's why I want to keep very much open to the notion that even the explanations we give to relate subjectivity to ideology, it's dialectical, it's contingent, it's bound to change. So tomorrow these explanations might be irrelevant. Even like Hobbes was irrelevant to Cleopatra, I think our explanation of the relationship between ideology and subjectivity, it's bound to become irrelevant as well.
While we're at it, why don't we just get rid of dialectics too? It's imagine sometimes non-events are just spontaneous and signify nothing.
Maybe. Yeah, like the end of this episode. The end of this episode can be completely spontaneous.
Yes, completely out of nowhere. Because we might have to, we're going to have to maybe do a second one on this. But I was also thinking about your CIA episode, Pills, or your CIA video. Because I actually went before we recorded back to the report that I think you link on the video. Because I was trying to think, is Althusser mentioned there? Just like, about the, what's it called?
CIA,
just like the way in which the CIA like analyzed the French intellectuals and determined, probably rightly so, that they're not a threat at all.
They're not.
Was he on there?
I couldn't find him because the document isn't like highlightable, you know, so you can't search. But I did skim through and I found his mention once. It seemed like they were really talking about more recent theories than Althusser. Like Althusser was kind of the generation before what that report seemed to be talking about. Yeah,
he would have been kind of threatening because he was so committed to the party.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Well,
yeah.
He wasn't invited to the famous John Hopkins conference, and was it 1966 that Derrida broke his fame at in America anyway? Yeah. He was not invited. Everyone else was, but not Althusser.
What a party!
Well, yeah, I think I already gave my critique, which is that feminist point I made earlier.
You should end this episode the way that The Sopranos ended.